Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honour today to introduce Mary McAleese.
Let's hit the ground running. Mary, at what point did you move from being a cradle Catholic to become a questioning, challenging Catholic that we saw in action in Rome?
That would have been a very long time ago. Growing up in Belfast, of course, Cradle Catholic, born into a Catholic family, eldest of 9 children. I only look back on it now and think how very ridiculously lucky I was. I was born in Ardoyne, the parish of Ardoyne, which was dominated by the Holy Cross Monastery. At that time, as I was growing up, believe it or not, we had over 40 priests in that monastery. So that our parish was broken up into very small units. And not only did we have our own parish priest who regularly visited, in our case, our parish priest was a man called Father Honorius Kelly, who was an uncle of the late Frank Kelly, of Father Jack fame, and who told me privately that he might actually have modelled. Finish the sentence for yourselves. And we knew him as Father Honorius. He was Phelim Kelly to his own name, so I have a brother Phelim. But our house was also a house that a lot of priests came to, including anybody who was vaguely connected with Roscommon, because my father was from Roscommon, and anybody vaguely connected with the road to Roscommon, which included a wonderful man from near Mullingar, a priest called Father Justin Coyne. He was the priest who was in charge of children in the parish, and for some reason that I have never been really able to understand, he became a kind of mentor to me. And after Mass on Sunday evening, he arrived in our house. I wasn't to know at that time. He was still a very young man in his 40s, but he was dying of cancer, and which he never ever told of or complained of. The only vanity he had was that he had to have a hard chair. The cancer was in his spine. I didn't know that for a long time either. But anyway, every Sunday, he paid me the compliment of sitting talking about God and church and metaphysics, and he was the most open man I think I ever met. More importantly, I was probably from about 13 or 14 right up until I was almost 18. These conversations took place every Sunday evening. And I thought that everybody in the country had this, your own private, personal conversation. And he was the kind of person who never said, here's what you must think. It was always, what do you think yourself about that? What do you think about heaven? What do you think about church? What do you think about God? How do you feel about God? And really, I think it was through that process that I came to my own lively, deep-rooted faith in God, and found, if you like, a voice in the church. I mean, I think the first critical letter that I ever wrote to anybody was to a bishop, and it was to Bishop Philbin. I was probably about 17 at the time, and I wrote complaining of how he had treated Father Des Wilson. And he treated Father Des abysmally, and Father Des is a good guy, and still is a good guy. So I wrote and complained about it, because I also grew up in a household. My father's great heroes, to whom he introduced us, but particularly the greatest hero was Dan O'Connell, and the lawyer, the great champion of human rights, the man who really introduced democracy to the British Parliament and who introduced the human rights of Russian Jews, of Presbyterians, of Catholics, of American slaves. He was their champion. He was the Nelson Mandela of his era. And I was raised in the tradition of O'Connell. So, ironically, my son Justin, who's with me here today, just to go back to Father Justin for a moment, the wonderful man, he died on the 22nd of June, 1969. And that was just shortly before my 18th birthday. Don't do the maths, please. Absolve me from that at least. But anyway, when he died, within 4 or 5 days, I had met the man who was to become my husband, Martin, and I just know from that moment that Justin was looking after me, because and I said from the very beginning, I remember on the very day of his funeral saying, if I ever have a son, my son will be called Justin, and I will dedicate him into the care of Father Justin, and he has looked after him magnificently over these years. Because the one thing I'm sure about out of my faith, and there's a few things I'm not sure about, one thing I am sure about is the sheer power, the sheer goodness, and the love that comes to us from the communion of saints. I've experienced it so many times in my life. I'd love to be able to. I mean, we were out the other night with some people. One of whom, sitting beside me, said he thought that people of faith were bonkers, and that that faith was essentially irrational. And I suppose, believe what you like. And I'd love to be able to. I'd love to be able to say all of that, but I can't really, because so many times over the course of my life, when I have needed the hope that God is. When you're really in need of a bit of TLC and a bit of reassurance, somehow from the communion of saints there's always come help. Almost always in the form of, Justin, or it could be a granny or a granddad, but almost always I feel the power of the communion of saints.
And Mary, from those early days, your talks with Father Justin, you went on then, because you loved the church, you wanted to help them, you became an advisor, you were working with the bishops in the New Ireland Forum. What fascinates me is that you were a total insider in those days in the 1990s. I mean, the bishops were running to you for advice. And now fast forward to Rome, and Cardinal Farrell won't allow you to speak in the Vatican. True. And when you write to the Pope to complain about the way you were treated, you don't even get the courtesy of a reply. You have gone from insider to outsider.
Yes, it happened all right. Quite not entirely sure how that kind of occurred, because if you go back to the New Ireland Forum, it's very interesting. Back in 1984, it was Archbishop Ryan then who asked me to join the church delegation of 6 people, to be one of the 2 lay people who would represent the church at the New Ireland Forum. And I said to him, straight back to him, I said, you do know I'm a founder member of the Campaign for Homosexual Law Reform, for gay rights, essentially, as we would call it nowadays. And I said, the forum is a live forum. You could be asked any question. And I said, if I was there and I was asked a question about gay rights or about homosexual law reform, I'm not going to rehearse church teaching, because I don't believe it. I believe it to be wrong. And I can still remember him looking so bemused at me and saying, did I ask you to? Mm-hmm. And I said, no, actually you didn't. And he said, well, I'm not going to. He said, you're free to say whatever you want. And that was then. It wouldn't happen now. It just wouldn't happen now.
So that just shows how things have gone backwards.
They have. But interestingly, during the course of John Paul II's pontificate, I wrote to him on 3 occasions. And I was very worried, particularly when he brought out the first document on the exclusion of women from priesthood. And I wrote to him and said, look, I have 3 children. I can't teach them this stuff. I won't teach them this stuff. I don't believe it. I find it unconvincing. And I have tried in every way possible to get to the bottom of it. I've read every article written. I've read all the experts. And really, I'm just not convinced. I think that the theology is poor. And I said, so I'm presuming now that I am out of communion with the church, and I don't want to be. But I find I could not possibly believe in a Christ, the divinity of Christ, if he was just one of these mean-spirited, mediocre theologians who writes this stuff. And, in fairness to John Paul, I just got the loveliest letters back from somebody, not from him. Mm-hmm. He didn't sign the letters, but somebody belonging to him signed the letters. And so reassuring, saying, don't worry, this is what the Pope teaches, and we accept that this is what you have, this is where you're at. The Pope, all he asks you to do is to accept this is where he's at. He accepts where you're at. And I thought, well, I can live with that. I can keep on trundling on that basis. But apparently things have changed remarkably now, and they don't even answer letters now even anymore. So.
You described the Catholic Church when you were out in Rome as an empire of misogyny. Why is the hierarchical church so against or so hostile to women?
I think it's it's an embedded historic attitude. It's an embedded historic reality. It's not Christian. It does not derive from Christ. Very interesting to see what Pope Francis had to say about women this week. If any of you had a chance to read, he made a comment earlier. Was it yesterday? Where he said that there is the role of women before Christ and the role of women after Christ, and that Christ is the watershed after which the equal dignity of women is recognized. And I believe that absolutely. I think that is absolutely true. I only wish that the church believed it and acted upon it. But I think also we have to accept and acknowledge that what I might call the curial church, the institutional church, still behaves in a really, well, first of all, it's a medieval structure. It was not designed by Christ. Thanks be to God, it wasn't designed by Christ. If I thought it was designed by Christ, then I would be somewhere else. But it was a man-made medieval structure designed for what was an imperial church, an empire. It was a temporal empire and a spiritual empire. Pope was king and he was emperor. He had armies. They used appalling cruelty. They thought nothing of thumbscrews and worse. People were not entitled to have their own opinions. People who ran against the church, up against the church, found their lives made very, very miserable, and sometimes the lives even ended. So, and that continued. I mean, the empire continued right up until 1870, and for the 60 years after that, the church behaved as if the empire was coming back. We had the prisoner of the Vatican, so-called, after Pius IX lost the papal states. I mean, he didn't just actually misplace them now, but as would happen in our house, you can lose the keys down the side of the sofa. He didn't just lose the empire down the side of a papal sofa. I mean, he actually, his actions conduced to its demise over a significant period of time. I mean, you can't go around kidnapping Jewish children and taking them away from their homes as he did, and incurring the wrath of your supporters around the world, who then turn on you, the people you're relying on to protect you and protect your papal states. Through his actions, he lost their trust, and he lost his own credibility, and he lost the papal states. I'm delighted he lost the papal states, frankly. I think that the idea of the Catholic Church as a temporal empire, I find that appalling and unhelpful. I don't think that, because that is not what Christ created either. So that thinking, right up until the end of the 19th century, that idea of church as empire, and more importantly, as entitled, the entitlement. You read Pio Nono's writings on this, they're quite extraordinary. For a man who had started out his career as a liberal but rapidly changed, where he talks about, that it is God's will that essentially the church, the Pope, will guide the politics and the spiritual life of the entire world. Now, nowadays we would look at that and we would be mortally embarrassed at the idea of this lack of separation of church and state. Because it was about controlling them. It wasn't about infusing the body politic and civic society with the love of Christ. It was about saying, you will do what the Pope says. Governments will do what the Pope says. You must believe. Now, that world has evaporated, and it has particularly evaporated in the latter part of the 20th century, really since the advent of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.